Today's sermon is going to be delivered in two halves. This first part refers back to the Isaiah passage that I read, Isaiah chapter 52 and chapter 53. And the second part will refer to the Mark Gospel reading, which will be read the next time I'm on here after the next hymn. Isaiah wrote sometime around the period of around 740 to 686 BC, before Christ. He wrote in that sort of period of time. So the passage that we've just read was written well over, probably around 700 years or over 700 years before the birth of Jesus. Isaiah wrote into a particular context. Ultimately, Israel had turned against God. They'd refused to do what he wanted. Time and time again, a good king had been on the throne, and the nation had turned back to God. A bad king had come to the throne and they'd turned against God. Ultimately, the only thing that was going to happen in the future was that exile was going to come to the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. Israel and Judah had separated. Two tribes had gone off in one direction. That you will hear that in the Old Testament referred to as Judah, and Israel was the other 10 tribes. Israel eventually went into exile in the year 734, just at that time when Isaiah was around. But Isaiah is prophesying in this particular context to Judah. Judah was still very much alive and kicking. In 734, when Israel went into captivity, they were taken into captivity by the Assyrians. And Judah stayed as a separate entity that existed until around the year 605 BC, when they were taken into captivity for the Babylonians. And Isaiah is prophesying and he's saying, why won't you turn back to God? If you will humble yourself, do all these things. He repeats himself. There's lots of chapters in Isaiah. It's quite heavy to wade through. Isaiah is speaking to them. But ultimately, they reject what Isaiah said as they rejected what other prophets had said. And ultimately, exile was the fate of what we became known as the Jewish people. I say that because they weren't known as the Jews until that time. Sorry, they weren't known as the Jews until well after that time. Exile was the fate ultimately of both Israel and of Judah. The old covenant, the law of Moses that we get in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Israel had rejected it, and their biggest sin was that of idolatry. They'd worshipped other things in place of God. Idolatry in terms of idols they made and other things, and we have idolatry happens today. We just worship different things. They might be things that are that are financial. They might be interests, hobbies, but people worship different things. Israel committed idolatry and so did Judah. So ultimately God judged them. And Israel went into captivity, and they were followed some 120, 30 years later by Judah. It's into that context that Isaiah writes that passage that I read earlier from the end of Isaiah chapter 52 and going into chapter 53. Ultimately, even though he wrote that, he was writing into the future. And that bit that I read is referred to as the passage around the suffering servant, which is why I read it, which is the title that Charles gave to today's sermon, as he chose the titles for the sermons. At the time, I'm sure they had no idea what it referred to. But looking back, many Christians today see this passage as referring to Jesus, it being a messianic prophecy about Jesus. The Jewish nation have argued and see in many ways that passage referring to them. The actual fact, the suffering servant is Israel as a nation, and they've looked back and they see that as being them. But as we see the ministry of Jesus unfolding, we see that Jesus quotes from this passage on a number of occasions, and Jesus suggests it's about him. He points to himself. For example, in Luke chapter 22 and verse 37, he says this: "It is written, and he was numbered with the transgressors. And I tell you that this must be fulfilled in me." Yes, what is written about me is reaching his fulfillment. That phrase, "and he was numbered with the transgressors," is taken directly from that passage at the end of Isaiah 52 and 53. And a number of other occasions, as we will see when we look at the New Testament passage, Jesus looks back and quotes directly from Isaiah chapter 52 and 53, and more or less says, that is referring to me. So this has become a really important passage when it talks about the suffering servant. Obviously, at the time when it was written, probably Isaiah, I'm not sure Isaiah knew himself what it actually related to, but he wrote it. But when we look at the Gospel in Mark, we'll look at one or two more of these scriptures where Jesus directly quotes from the Old Testament, from Isaiah, and says, this is me, this is fulfilled in me, and I am fulfilling these words. But more about that in a moment. We will stop and we will have a hymn, and then we'll have our second reading from the Gospel of Mark.